Take a trip to the moon or Mars today. I am Tonya Hall, and joining me is Andy Weir, author of The Martian, Artemis, Cheshire Crossing, and Project Hail Mary. This is part one in a two-part interview with Andy Weir. Be sure to catch part two right here as well. Welcome, Andy.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Andy, I'm sure many of our audience are familiar with your science fiction books, The Martian and Artemis. What other types of writing do you do?
Well, a lot of people know me for the short story I wrote called The Egg, which was really popular. It became kind of a meme thing. It was like I banged it out in 40 minutes one night and threw it on my website. I didn't expect it to become a big thing, but that was actually before The Martian. That was the thing that kind of first put me out there. And so that was pretty cool. I also wrote, as you mentioned, Cheshire Crossing, and that was a comic I did also in the pre-Martian days. But now, um, now that I kind of have a name for myself, people looked at Cheshire Crossing and said like, "Oh, hey, this could be good." And so they got the extremely talented Sarah Anderson to redo the art. It's a comic book. I should have opened with that. Um, I am a terrible artist, and I'm the first to admit it. But I wanted to make a comic back then, so I did. And they looked at it and said, "This is a great comic script. Let's get an artist." And so they got Sarah Anderson, who most people know from Sarah's Scribbles, this hilarious little comic that she does. But she's also a very good artist. That you don't really see that in her comic. She deliberately makes the comic to be fast to draw. But anyway, that went really well. And in the future, I'll be known as the author of Project Hail Mary, which is my next book coming out in hopefully spring of 2021.
Which we're all looking forward to.
Thanks.
Artemis was released in 2017 as a thriller about a lady with an agenda on humankind's first lunar colony. NASA decided much later to put their first woman on the moon as a part of a mission they also named Artemis. Is there any connection?
Yeah, it's embarrassing, really, that NASA just follows me around trying to be like me. No, it's a pure coincidence. Well, it's less of a coincidence, more of just a common cause. Artemis is Artemis is Apollo's twin sister in mythology, and she's also the goddess of the moon. So it's a pretty obvious mythological figure to name a moon-related thing after. And also, there's a long history of naming space missions after mythological figures. So it was kind of just a coincidence, but I love that people think NASA named it after my book. I mean, they're wrong, but I love that people think that.
Well, I think I already knew that, but I did think it was a very happy coincidence. Your
Yeah,
two
it's awesome.
your two blockbuster space novels are recognized for their scientific accuracy. For The Martian, you even wrote your own programs to determine the best date for an Earth Mars mission alignment, which I think is super geeky and so awesome. What kind of research does it take to tell a compelling story that remains scientifically credible?
Well, um, first off, neither of my books are like 100% perfect science-wise. There are honest mistakes, and I guess, for lack of a better term, dishonest mistakes, like things where I deliberately hand-waved some science. And so it's all about how accurate can I possibly make it, and I want to be as accurate as possible. That's just kind of my thing. And I guess in terms of the research, getting it right is kind of easy for me because I really like doing the research and the math and the science. It's my favorite part. And everybody's knowledgeable at their hobbies. My hobby is space stuff. If you're like way into cars, then you're going to start off with a big head start on anything related to cars. And when you do research, you'll know where to look and how to find the information you want and who to talk to. So I'm no different. It's just that my interest happens to be space travel. So between my kind of like more than average knowledge base plus a nice internet connection and Google, I mean, that's pretty much everything you need to research space. Um, the cool thing about space and the space program and stuff like that is that most of it, I mean, there's Air Force programs and stuff like that, but most of it's public. It's very public. NASA's very public. And the people who work on these things are very proud of it. This is like, hey, if somebody worked on the Apollo program, that's what they'll open with when they're meeting you. It's like, hey, 50 years ago, I designed this little widget for the Apollo program. I mean, it is an immense source of pride for the people who've worked on these things. And so they make websites about it. They talk about it in great detail. So all that information there is very easy to find if you just Google around for it.
What science fiction from the last 100 years is your favorite?
Oh, from the last 100 years. Oh, see, I was going to talk about the Barsoom saga, but that's from more than 100 years ago. So I guess no. Um, no, for me, it's interesting. I grew up reading my father's science fiction collection. He had a big bookshelf full of paperbacks from the 50s and 60s. So I'm a Gen Xer. My father's a boomer, but I ended up growing up reading boomer science fiction. So for me, my holy trinity is Isaac Asimov, Arthur C. Clarke, and Robert Heinlein. So those are the writers I grew up reading, and that's maybe why my stories are a little more in that bent of just they all had really positive views of the future, like that science is good and humanity will be better in the future. We'll still have our problems, we'll have new and unique problems, but you would rather live in one of their books in the future than right here today, right? It's an optimistic, aspirational view of the future, and that's kind of how I roll in my writing. And I'm sure I got that by reading them.
Hollywood news sources report that your next space novel, Project Hail Mary, is already scheduled to become a movie. A movie based on Artemis is in pre-production, and the movie The Martian won a Golden Globe for Best Actor and Best Actor Performance, rather, and was nominated for 7 Oscars. How is your
That's right. It
Hollywood?
actually won the best.
Go
Sorry.
ahead.
It also won Golden Globe for Best Picture.
See, well then,
See,
how, how has congratulations? How has your Hollywood
thanks.
success influenced your writing?
I've tried not to let it influence the writing. My job is, I always see it as my job is to write books. I'm not writing movies. I'm when I'm writing a book, I don't think of it in terms of, oh, this might get made into a movie. I have to make sure it works in that medium. I'm just always writing books. And so I try not to let it affect my stories, storytelling technique, anything like that. Basically, like the Martian film was like the greatest advertisement for the book ever. Like I sold so many copies of The Martian as a result of that film that it allowed me to like live out a really live a very happy, comfortable, dare I say, wealthy life, and just be a full-time writer. So I guess I would say it hasn't affected my writing, but it's affected my life surrounding the writing, allowing me to write kind of whatever I want, which is awesome.
What's the hardest part of storytelling?
For me, the hardest part is exposition. Um, so different writers will give you different answers, of course, but for me, I just hate describing inanimate objects. Like, okay, for whatever reason, I have to describe the layout of a room or what a house looks like from the front or this, that, and the other thing. And I just hate it because it's so boring. It's so boring to write. You end up, and it's boring to read, in my opinion, which is why I generally be as light. I'm generally as light on exposition as I can be, because I'll just be like, yeah, okay, they're in a meeting room. There, you've seen meeting rooms in your life. You've already, if I say, oh, these two characters are in a meeting room, your brain has already assembled an image of a meeting room. I don't need to say like, oh, the long mahogany table was flanked on either end by comfortable lumbar support chairs. A bookshelf stood neatly in the corner with reference manuals should anyone in the meeting. Who gives a crap? When I'm writing, I want the action to move forward. I want the plot to advance. I want dialogue to happen. And so I just hate exposition. And also, I never, unless it's critical to the story in some way, I never tell the reader what characters look like. You know, what's Mark Watney's hair color or eye color in the book? You never know. I never even say his ethnicity. You assume he's Caucasian, but I never said that.
That's true. I In fact, I want and I want to say that too, that it's funny because you're talking about, your writing and your creativity, but I want to say that a lot of people may not realize you're an engineer to begin with, right? Like you started as an engineer, but you're
Yeah,
also
that's right.
obviously very left brain and very right brain because you're also a very creative writer. Let's say there's
Well,
another
thank you.
engineer out there who has followed your work, but they're also have an interest in writing. What would your advice to them be?
Well, I have general advice for anyone who wants to be a writer, not just engineers. But I'll start by saying, if you're an engineer, the topic of your writing should be something well, not just an engineer, whoever you are, the topic of your writing should be something you're passionate and knowledgeable about. So if you're an engineer, you're some kind of engineer, and there's probably some mad science idea you have in the back of your mind. Maybe think of that as a direction to go for a story. Um, but for everyone who wants to be a writer, I have my three pieces of advice I like to give. First off, you have to actually write. In order to be a writer, you have to write. You have to sit down at your word processor and type words into a document. You can sit around and think about the storyline and the structure and what's going to happen all you want, but until you're actually writing things down, you're just daydreaming. And daydreaming isn't writing. Okay, so you have to get it down on paper. And what sucks is as soon as you start doing that, everything goes wrong. You start to realize this won't work, that won't work, this is boring. Oh my God, I have to describe 1,000 years of history of this kingdom before the reader can even understand who the main character is. This is when you start realizing what you've got to cut, what you've got to trim down, and so on. So you have to actually write. Number two, and this is hard, you have to resist the urge to tell your story to your friends and family. You have to keep it to yourself, make it a secret. Uh, Make yourself a rule that the only way anyone experiences your story is by reading it. Now, you can still like give it to your friends like a chapter at a time or something like that, so you don't have to finish the entire book. You can say like, hey, I wrote the first chapter of my book, would you read it, or whatever. Now, why am I giving this advice? Because when you verbally tell someone your story, it satisfies your need for an audience and it makes you less likely to go write it. Most writers are driven by a desire to have other people experience the story they came up with. So when you tell the story to people, they have now experienced the story you came up with and you feel mission accomplished. Don't don't let that happen. Keep your motivation up by going, when I'm done writing this chapter, people will read it, they'll experiencing it, and then I'll get the feedback and the sweet external validation that I crave. And so that's advice number two. And finally, number three is there has never been a better time in human history to self-publish, ever. In the old days, if you were a writer in the 70s or 80s and you wanted to, and you couldn't get a publishing contract, you couldn't get people interested, self-publishing was very expensive. You had to vanity press your books. You had to try to convince bookstores to carry them on consignment, and it was almost always a losing proposition. It cost you a lot of money, wasted you a lot of time. Nowadays, you can self-publish for free for literally zero economic risk on your part. You can just put it up on Kindle Direct Publishing or Barnes and Noble, or there are lots of avenues where you can put your stuff up and charge for it. So there's no longer an old boy network between you and the reader. You can just put it up there for people to see, and if it's good, it'll get around by word of mouth. So those are my bits of advice for would-be writers.
Great advice. It certainly worked out well for you. Andy Weir,
Yeah,
author
thanks.
of The Martian, Artemis, Cheshire Crossing, and Project Hail Mary. If somebody wants to connect with you, Andy, maybe they want to find out more about what's happening with your work, how can they do that?
Well, they can find me on Facebook, Andy Weir, or Twitter, Andy Weir Author. And you can always email me. My email address would be annoying to spell out right here, but you can just Google around and find my email address. It's very public, and I answer all fan mail.
Don't forget to check out part 2 of my interview with Andy Weir right here. And find more of my interviews here or at tonyahall.net. Thanks for watching.